Let's get things rolling. Season 2, episode number 17 with Dr. Stu Phillips. Enjoy. I'm joined today by Professor Stu Phillips, a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Skeletal Muscle Health, Professor in Kinesiology, and Adjunct Professor in the School of Medicine at McMaster University in Canada. He is a Fellow of the American College of Sports Medicine and the American College of Nutrition, and his research is focused on the impact of nutrition and exercise on human skeletal muscle protein turnover. Professor Phillips currently has more than 18,000 career citations and 200 original scientific research and review papers. Prof, thanks so much for taking the time today.
My pleasure, Mark. Thanks for having me on the show.
Well, listen, before we start talking supplements and athletic performance, can you perhaps kick things off by sharing a little bit more about your background and how you got interested in sport and research?
Yeah, sure. I played all kinds of sports growing up. I'd probably say that between hockey and rugby, that rugby was my number one sport growing up. I played it throughout my university career. I did an undergrad in biochemistry, and the only reason I did an undergrad in biochem as opposed to kinesiology, because at the time kinesiology didn't exist at McMaster. That's where I did my undergrad. It was physical education, and I just wanted a little bit more science than that. So I followed the biochem route. In my fourth year, I took a course in nutrition, which opened my eyes up to a whole new discipline. And things have just kind of grown from there. So it's a real pleasure to be able to blend my interests in nutrition, and particularly in protein, with something related to athletic performance.
Yeah, that's fantastic. The rest is history, as they say, right?
Yeah, the rest is history. Exactly, yeah.
Awesome. Well, you recently were a co-author along with a group of world experts like yourself on the IOC consensus statement, Dietary Supplements and the High Performance Athlete. Before we dive into the evidence-based supplements for athletes, could you perhaps do a quick review of the hierarchy of scientific evidence for all the trainers, practitioners, etc., listening in, and how that's used to establish good practice?
Yeah, I will say right off the bat that was one of the most difficult papers that I have ever been part of writing. The list of authors are numerous, and the people involved in the process, you can imagine, when the IOC steps into this world, were extensive. So required the coordination of a lot of people, and there was agreement and disagreement, and a lot of controversy and conversation along the way, because WADA was involved as well, as you might imagine. So it was really difficult, but when it comes to evidence, the basis of a lot of this is really starts with anecdotal observation. Athlete X takes supplement Y and achieves outcome Z, if you like. And then I think after a while, science begins to catch up, and you get a couple of studies. The better studies would be a randomized controlled trial in which things were blinded. And then eventually you begin to accumulate enough of these randomized trials that you can begin to perform so-called meta-analyses, which are considered to be sort of the highest level of evidence as far as evidence-based, if you like, practice or medicine is concerned, because now you've got disparate populations, you've got different places around the world, you've got different athletes, and when consistent patterns begin to emerge, either things do or do not work, then you're far more confident in the outcome. So essentially, when you boil a lot of what we said in that paper down, it really does come down to things having a pretty good evidence base and really having some kind of meta-analysis. Though I will admit, not in all cases, and in some cases, we just had to say, you know what, there's not enough evidence right now, but maybe in a few years we could endorse that. But I'll tell you, man, it wasn't easy. It was really controversial right from the beginning all the way down to the final drafts. I think we went through 37 drafts of that manuscript. So, wow. Yeah.
And of course, in the paper, you guys kick things off by looking at the prevalence of supplement use. So how did things like an athlete's training level, age, gender, or even the cultural norms impact things on that front?
Well, I mean, I think that this is the important point is that the IOC, until this paper came out, really had adopted the stance that supplements were not necessary. In other words, you can do all this via diet alone. And I think athletes and coaches around the world had sort of been screaming for a long time that that's just not the case, that there are some supplements that do have an evidence base, and the IOC needs to move from beyond that. But clearly in the back of their mind was always the issue of contamination and strict liability as far as the athlete's concerned. But I mean, supplement use is extraordinarily prevalent. I mean, not just in athletes, but in the general population. So, it represents, I think, a real step into what's going on in the 21st century. But all the way up from, sort of grassroots, even youth level sports, and then increasingly prevalent, particularly in body composition, physique competition, all the way up to elite sports, you're seeing supplement use. I would find it actually pretty difficult to believe that there's an athlete out there that's not using some form of supplementation that we had described in that manuscript.
Yeah, it's terrific because you guys also do a great job of talking about sort of the rationales and the motives for using supplements for sport. Can you walk people through a few of the ones that you listed in the paper?
Yeah, well, I mean, clearly the first one is to say it's going to somehow enhance your performance, whatever your performance indicator would be, and that could be physique, it could be to be bigger, it could be to have less body fat, it could be to be faster, et cetera, and all the things that we sort of associate with performance. But it might be monetary. There are a lot of athletes who are making money from endorsements, and you can't ignore that in some situations. It could also be that this is a team philosophy, that this is what coaches do, that this is what certain practices that happen in certain clubs. It could be peer pressure from other athletes. I have a long-standing axiom that I tell people that the success of a particular athlete and the anecdote that they can give for a supplement are directly proportional. So if you're a gold medal winner and you were taking this when you won, and you tell another athlete, I'd be willing to bet that other athlete would take the supplement just to see what happens. So the sources are multiple, and you can't really discount one over the other.
And let's if we shift gears here and actually talk about the supplements you identified as directly improving performance. There are a lot of claims out there, as you mentioned, anecdotal evidence, but what were some of the ones that you guys identified as having the strongest evidence?
Yeah, it really, and I think the list is short compared to the number of supplements out there, which in and of itself is a statement of really, to try to cut through some of the marketing hype that surrounds a lot of supplements. I always say that the ratio of supplements that have been successful to the ratio of supplements that have not is extremely small. So we essentially boiled the evidence down. We came up with caffeine, more so in its isolated form rather than in the cup of coffee. But there are some people who could do very well with a cup of coffee. Thank you very much. Creatine, sure. Which is, it stood the test of time as a body composition supplement and enhancing sprint performance. Bicarbonate, which probably I think a lot of people roll their eyes and say, "Oh boy, how does baking soda even make the list?" But again, it's stood the test of time, not without some of its drawbacks. A little bit of a newcomer on the list and sort of on the fringe would be beta-alanine, and also sort of on the outside would be some nitrates. So beetroot being the I guess most obvious example, but the traditional protein powder is up there, carbohydrate provision. Those are sort of standard, I guess. But as far as supplements go, the list is actually pretty short.
For sure, and obviously caffeine being so deeply embedded in sport and everyone's mind in terms of performance. So can you maybe talk about some of the different mechanisms on how it's actually exerting some of those effects?
Yeah, I mean, I think that caffeine's undergone. I mean, it's been around for a long period of time. There's a lot of mechanisms on how it might work. I think for a long time, people were convinced that it increased lipolysis, so breakdown of fat tissue, and that somehow spared muscle glycogen. I think most people now, if they agree with that mechanism, they would agree that it's not the most prevalent mechanism, that there actually may be something direct to do with caffeine acting on the muscle per se. But most of caffeine's effects really come from the central nervous system stimulation and the arousal that accompanies that. That a lot of us enjoy in the morning when we wake up and kind of get the day going. But for an athlete, it really does seem to suggest that that's where the most of the performance adaptations occur. Now, I will say this, and it's really interesting actually that. Nancy Guest, who is a dietitian of some fame in this area, just published a paper in Medicine, Science, Sports, and Exercise showing that actually your genotype, so what types of genes you have for your ability to be able to metabolize caffeine, somehow determine the fact of whether you're going to benefit or not. So it's worth looking into. For some people, they get a bit of a buzz from coffee, but they don't get a huge performance boost. For some people, they get a moderate boost, and then other people, it's like rocket fuel. But it seems to be one of the most consistent performance boosters that we came across.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. Had Nancy on the podcast last year, and she'll be coming back to talk about some of her new research. And it's really interesting, that genetic side of things. And
yeah, there you go. I mean, there's the other layer that I think we're beginning to sort of peel back, and Nancy and Ahmed's research his lab down at UFP are right at the hotbed of sort of looking at some of these genetic polymorphisms and their role. So yeah, again, as much as we know, then we're beginning to learn more and more about something different as well.
and how do some of the dosing strategies potentially differ then, if you're more endurance-based bout of exercise versus something like repeated sprints when talking about caffeine?
Yeah, I think when you look at caffeine historically, you're really looking at doses when people sort of, I think, thought in the lab, we really need to see an effect. And so there are doses as high as 9 milligrams, per kilogram body weight, for example. And I think a lot of work now suggests that you can get down to probably as low as between 1 to 3 milligrams per kilogram. And again, this is the pure caffeine form, so not a cup of coffee. And I don't know that it differs an awful lot between, with each respective sport, but it appears that, it's a pretty low threshold. And I think that there was a concept for a while that if you were a habitual caffeine consumer, that you needed to withdraw yourself from caffeine. And again, most of the recent research has suggested that's not the case. So you don't have to skip that cup of coffee for it to have its benefit, or take your caffeine capsule or whatever it is. So it's a pretty consistent effect, and I think settling around 3 milligrams per kilo body weight is really the dose that's sort of a sweet spot.
Yeah, definitely. As folks get up towards 5 or 6, even, you start to see, potentially some of the effects of getting too much caffeine in the system. And of course, you guys write about the pairing caffeine with carbohydrates during exercise. Why is that so important?
Yeah, that work comes. A lot of that comes from Louise Burke and her work down at the Australian Institute of Sport. And I think the carbohydrate provision stories been out there for a long time. And really, what you're doing is providing yourself with an alternative fuel source from, if you like, liver standpoint. So you're acting as a surrogate liver. And the provision of caffeine used to be thought of as just a pre-exercise strategy, but certainly during exercise is a time when Louise and her crew were looking at cyclists and actually found that they got a little performance boost even during the event as well. So the old story was that the cyclists were drinking, defizzed Coke,
Yeah.
and saying, "Hey, we're getting a lift from this," and then Louise and her crew said, "Well, it's the sugar that's in the Coke." But there's, not an insubstantial amount of caffeine that goes along with that. So lo and behold, again, the anecdotal field test cyclists were feeding back turned out to be when they tested it in the lab, that exactly the way things were working. So there's practice informs science, and science goes back and informs practice.
Absolutely. And talking about that science informing practice, you mentioned before dietary nitrates. Can you talk about some of the mechanisms at play there to support performance?
Yeah, no, this is the kind of new kid on the block. I
Yep.
mean, I always joke with people that if you'd have told me maybe not 5 years ago, but maybe 6 or 7 years ago, you go, beetroots are going to be the next big thing in performance enhancement, I'd have laughed right in your face. And I said, not a chance. But beetroots in this sense are really, they're the vehicle for the conveyance of nitrates. And the nitrates, to remind everybody, really come from the soil. So an interesting anecdote here is that Andy Jones, who's the guy sort of behind the big beetroot craze, if
Andy
you like.
Beetroot.
Yeah, Andy Beetroot. Yeah, he will tell you that if there are beets that are grown in nitrate poor soil, they're not quite as effective as beets grown in nitrate-rich soil. And of course, there are lots of other sources. We call it arugula. On the other side of the Atlantic, they call it rocket. But if you eat a lot of arugula, you're getting actually per gram of arugula, you're getting a lot more nitrate. How it actually works, there's sort of two theories. One is that it's enhancing nitric oxide production. And nitric oxide, I think, if you don't or if you do know, but it's a vasodilator, so it's increasing blood flow delivery to the muscle. But there's a group of Swedish researchers that have shown that nitrate actually acts at the level of the mitochondria to improve mitochondrial ATP production and efficiency. And I'm not sure where the science lies on which of these is the best, or the theory that's sort of bearing fruit. But it could be a combination, and in all likelihood, that's probably where most things tend to lie, of those two mechanisms. Trent Stillingworth would be the first to remind me to tell you that the more elite people get, the less effective those things tend to become. So I'm not saying it's not a good strategy, but I'm sure again that you tend to get these responders and non-responders at the highest levels. Some people swear by it. Other people are like, yeah, it did nothing for me.
Absolutely. And is there a duration of exercise bout that is best supported there in terms of timing or dose with the dietary nitrates?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it's sort of it's I would say sprint-ish up to middle distance. Long distance events, I think, are more equivocal, but again, these sort of 400, 800, 1500 meter type events those are the events where most of the performance advantages are seen. And similarly, whether it's running or rowing or anything like that. So not too long. I would call them, yeah, I mean, sort of they're grueling. I mean, it's a sprint, but it's just a very long sprint.
Yeah, absolutely. Tough work to get those types of sprints in.
Yeah.
That sort of dovetails into the sodium bicarb, which you mentioned, of course, on the list. And can you again kind of refresh people on how that mechanism works?
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of age old stuff, and it's really about a quick lesson in pH balance. So acidity, whether it be excuse me, in the blood or intramuscular. Clearly not a particularly good thing. Most athletes find that, that's when things start to go south in terms of fatigue and performance. And bicarbonate makes a small adjustment in blood pH, makes you a little bit more basic and allows you to buffer your blood pH a little bit better. And the real downside of bicarbonate are obviously the gastrointestinal problems that occur in some people. It has to be taken in pretty close proximity to the event. It's not a lasting effect. And so, you need to time that with respect to the event somewhere between sort of half an hour or so before the event. And that's not the best time to, if you don't react particularly well, to kind of get rid of those GI symptoms. So, the advice is always practice it in practice, in a simulated race before you try it in the real deal where it really is going to count. So again, sprint type activities, repeated sprints, that sort of thing. Some people are able to handle it, other people not so much.
Yeah, it's definitely one in practice. I can see a higher percentage with the GI distress, and just as you mentioned in the paper there. But you guys also provide some practical strategies as well for helping to potentially mitigate some of that GI distress. Can you share some of those with folks?
Yeah, I think, again, it's sort of dose and timing and the form of the bicarbonate and everything else that you can look at, and you can manipulate those and practice, again, and is sort of the best thing to try out with respect to, who can tolerate it and how much, and does it actually have an effect. So splitting up the doses into smaller doses as opposed to a large bolus, and really, the proximity to the event, I think, are some of the more common ones. Or ingesting it with some type of food or something like that could be another strategy. But I think the biggest thing that, when you talk to athletes about this, they figure it out pretty quickly. Some people are able to handle this in all kinds of doses, and it never really has an impact, whereas other athletes just, time and time again, they try it and they're like, oh, maybe that was just a bad experience. They try it again and it just never really works for them. So it makes you wonder again whether there is some sort of underlying genetic predisposition to your ability to be able to tolerate that.
Absolutely. I mean, it's amazing, as you said, athletes will inherently, obviously, when things around GI distress especially, they sort of give it that trial and error and find out pretty quick if there's a dose or timing that works for them, and if it doesn't, sort of moving on to something that's a bit more practical and applicable for them. Now, you guys also discuss supplements that indirectly support athletic performance, such as, via immune health. So what were some of the supplements that stood out there above the rest in terms of immunity?
Yeah, I think this is an area where the science gets a little bit gray, and it wasn't an area that I was directly involved with. So I'm paraphrasing, people like Professor Walsh and Dr. Matt Larson-Meyer, who were involved in this section. But certainly, probiotic supplements are very, very popular. And the thought is there, of course, that diversity of your gut flora, the type of microbes that you have in your gut, is going to confer some type of immune benefit. I think it would be fair to say that the results to this point have been a little bit equivocal. There are some truisms, and that is, first, it takes a tremendous amount of probiotic supplement to shift your gut flora, and you have to keep taking the supplement. So it's not like once you've taken it that these bugs grow in your gut and they stay there forever. That's not the case. But it does appear that microbiotic diversity, so in other words, the more diverse the species that you have in your gut are, that you do have some immune benefit that's associated with that. So I think that's sort of one of the, I hate to use the word trendy, but very popular right now. A lot of people definitely swear by this. They say it's really key and critical. Gut permeability is a big issue. Obviously, we talked about gastrointestinal health, so that's a big deal for athletes.
Yeah, especially endurance athletes as well. Those longer duration bouts definitely tough on the gut.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the longer the event, probably the greater the incidence of all kinds of GI distress. So, and that's maybe a gut blood flow issue or something like that. But those were, that along with, we talked about vitamin D extensively in the position stand. And a number of other sort of, I would call them sort of more peripheral players. So some beta glucan containing supplements, a few other sort of potential immune enhancers, but nothing that I would call as probably as prevalent. And maybe, although it lacks some of what we would call grade A evidence, definitely this probiotic supplementation, I think, is here to stay.
Yeah, it's amazing how some of the common supplements, especially for immunity, things like even supplemental glutamine, which, in speaking with Dr. Eric Helms earlier this year, a lot of the research around use in hospital settings and burn victims, etc., showing benefit, but when in general population or athletes, not so much on the immune side. And I noticed you guys as well found the evidence sort of lacking there of glutamine and the immune support.
Yeah, I mean, the difficult part with glutamine is, again, great theory. And if you take people like burn patients and people who are septic and, really, really sick people, when you give them glutamine, you bring it up from a deficient to a sufficient level. The hard part about glutamine is it's one of the most prevalent amino acids that are in your muscles. So taking it from sufficient to supra normal levels, just really, really difficult to do. We've tried a number of times in my lab to raise the levels of glutamine in people's muscle, and you just can't do it. So I think it's really a situation where the injury scenarios paint a picture that just doesn't transfer to normal people, sufficient levels to supra-normal. So yeah, glutamine didn't get a particularly good score.
Of course, some of the other supplements that you talk about in the indirectly improving performance, via their ability to, assist an athlete to train harder, to perhaps recover more quickly, prevent injury, accelerate return to play. Obviously, the top of the list was, creatine was there. I had Dr. Jose Antonio on last year talking creatine. And next up was HMB. So perhaps for listeners who aren't as familiar, can you describe what HMB is and how it can potentially impact performance?
Yeah, I mean, creatine's been around, as you mentioned. It stood the test of time. I was in grad school when Eric Holtman and he first started doing those creatine studies, and it's just fact. I mean, there's the testimony to a supplement that people have tested in science, athletes have tried, and it still keeps coming back. So that's probably, I think one of the things that you can look for. HMB is a leucine metabolite. So leucine, for people who don't know, is a key and critical core amino acid that turns on and stimulates muscle protein synthesis. HMB is a metabolite that's downstream from leucine, so it undergoes a number of chemical conversion steps, and it could stimulate muscle protein synthesis and suppress muscle protein breakdown. My sense is that the extent to which it can do that is probably of similar nature to leucine. I don't think it's going to be superior in any of those situations. But one of the scenarios where HMB does appear to be pretty effective is if people are returning from some type of injury. It certainly appears to restore lost lean mass, lost muscle mass pretty rapidly. So there's a situation where I think HMB might be of good use. But again, my opinion, at least based on some work that we've got, is that it's probably not going to be much better than leucine, to be honest with you.
And in terms of dosing or timing with the HMB, is there a certain strategy there?
Most of the dosing is available for the calcium form of the compound. So it's calcium HMB, and that's 3 grams per day. I think dosed usually at 2 1.5 gram doses. There is a newer form of the compound out there called the free acid form, and it appears to be similar doses, sort of a gram and a half per dose, maybe once or twice a day. But really, I look at HMB as being a recovery supplement more than anything else. But I'm a little bit skeptical of some of the data that's out there with respect to enhancements in muscle size. We've got some studies underway right now which suggest that it's probably not as effective as some people has found it.
Yeah, you mentioned in terms of total protein intake, if that's if someone has their total protein intake on point, then the benefits there could be pretty equivocal, no?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's probably the case with a lot of amino acid based supplements. And people talk about arginine and glutamine and all kinds of things, glycine and everything. And I think when you've got your, like as you said, you've got your protein requirements dialed in, it's hard to imagine that any of those amino acids are going to enhance your ability to recover or adapt to any greater degree. And that, clearly there's a limit with all of these things, but most people's protein intakes, if they're sort of up around where we're recommending, so say twice the RDA or about 1.6 grams per kilo per day, maybe up to as high as 2.2 grams per kilo per day, which is the old bodybuilding axiom of 1 gram per pound.
Yeah.
Then it's hard for me to imagine that individual amino acid supplements or branch chains or something like that could do anything more if you've got all of those things dialed in. So I stand to be corrected unless there's better science out there. But honestly, that's kind of our wheelhouse, and I can't think of any.
And of course, you guys also discuss the role of omega-3 fats, so perhaps a different mechanism here, but possibly increasing muscle protein synthesis and, of course, reducing symptoms of delayed onset muscle soreness. Are these findings consistent? And can someone achieve this potentially just from eating, fish from food sources rather than even supplements?
Yeah, that's a good question. Omegas have been around for a long time, obviously, and touted all kinds of potential health benefits. From the standpoint that you're discussing, again, the literature does appear to be pretty consistent. They are able to change something to do with stimulating muscle protein synthesis. So yeah, they might enhance an effect there. It really does seem that you need some pretty high doses. I'm not going to dismiss any dietary advice to eat fish. I think it's a great piece of advice, and I like fish, so I think it's
not a problem to add an extra dose
anyway. Yeah, most people's hack on fish is generally goes, oh, well, it's kind of fishy, and I'm like, oh, yeah, it is fish, but the fish oil appears to be that you do tend to need it to take it in fairly high doses. That will be difficult to get from eating fish alone. So it does appear that you need some kind of supplement, one that's particularly rich in EPA or eicosapentaenoic acid and DHA, the docosahexaenoic acid. Again, the anti-inflammatory side of things and the muscle soreness, I think a little bit grayer than most people would like. I don't see a big downside to taking it. It's a fairly low risk supplement. The one, if there is a downside, of course, is if you have some kind of trauma. In other words, if you get a bruise, then high doses of fish oil prolong bleeding time. And so sometimes the bruising that you can see if you're on this stuff can be fairly extensive.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously a blood thinner as well. So things like around surgeries, and shifting gears a little bit on the omega-3, though, you guys also have, there's a really interesting line of research around the use of, as you mentioned, high-dose omega-3s there for recovery from head trauma, concussion, which you guys touch on. Can you share some of the, where things are at, perhaps, in the research with that?
Yeah, so that's a really, I would love to be able to say, there's some really great research on that, and the evidence looks really good, and the answer is, can't say that right now, but what I would say is that, we know this, is that the phospholipids that are in neuronal cells in our brain, for example, are extraordinarily rich in these long-chain fatty acids. So the docosahexaenoic acid in particular may confer some protective effect against concussion. I'm waiting to see, and I'm sure they're going to come. If they're not happening already, I'm sure they're either being planned or they're probably underway, to be honest. some really good controlled randomized trials. Now, the problem is it has to be a pragmatic trial, because it's not like you can go around and induce a consistent concussion in one group and the same in another group, and sort of see what happens.
Yeah, tough to get that past the ethics board, right?
Yeah, it's not gonna fly. But it has to be pragmatic. So, clearly, sort of a convenient sample and look at concussion incidents, and then return to play and be able to pull out with enough numbers of participants that there is some beneficial impact. But again, when we talk about strategies that are potentially low risk and might yield a benefit, that's something where you might sort of want to check one off the list, particularly if someone has a history of concussions. So, but I'll be honest in saying that the evidence is, geez, I don't know just yet. So developing, keep an eye on that.
Early
Obviously,
days.
absolutely crucial area for a lot of athletes.
Yeah, I mean, obviously ice hockey, rugby, American football, so many sports where this is now becoming, even, soccer for that matter, such a hot topic at the moment. Of course, in the
Yeah.
paper, you guys have more sections, we haven't touched on today, such as supplements for physique change and correcting micronutrient deficiencies, insufficiencies. So definitely encourage everyone to have a read through the paper. But just want to jump over to the decision-making tree that you guys chose to include there at the end, which is terrific. Could you, explain that to folks and why you chose to add that to the paper?
Yeah, so there's two of them. One is these decision trees or flow charts, if you want to call them, for nutritional supplement use. So let's say you're told that you're iron deficient. So do I need an iron supplement? And the other one is about making a decision regarding supplement usage. So is creatine the right supplement for me, for example? And I think the main sort of the ethos is of both of those is, first of all, they look particularly complicated. But the point is to try to get across to the athlete and the coach that there are steps that need to be considered in each of those scenarios that have things involved in them that probably a lot of athletes just don't consider. It's sort of, a lot of athletes, I think, look at nutritional supplements as an insurance policy. Hey, I'm probably okay, but just in case I'm not, I'll take this. And in some situations, that's, first of all, it's a waste of your time and your money. And in other situations, it may actually be hampering your performance. And at worst, it could be exposing you, as is a theme that's common throughout the paper, to the risk of an anti-doping rule violation. And I hope it didn't come out too strong, but it was a particularly, I'll say that there were a lot of people that were very strongly wanted that message to come out, is that the policy of strict liability applies to athletes, particularly at the Olympic level. And every time you take a supplement, of course, unless you are 100% guaranteed where it came from, or basically, you controlled every ingredient that went into it, that's always a risk. The maturity of the athlete, whether you have an adverse reaction, is there any history of adverse reactions in your family, in your athletic group? And, all of these things are, I think, questions that a lot of athletes probably wouldn't ask themselves, or coaches wouldn't ask themselves. And so we tried to put a framework to something that would allow people to walk through somewhat of a decision tree. It seems a little bit overly prescriptive, but I'll be honest with you, again, given all the players that were at the table, it went back and forth, and I can tell you, since I was the person creating those trees, that they changed a lot. It was short,
I can imagine.
And then all of a sudden somebody said, but what about? And so,
yeah, I mean, they're terrific. And I think even, as you mentioned, people don't be intimidated by them. Just having a read through even once just really highlights a lot of the different, left turns and right turns people can take and what they should be considering. So it's really, I can't imagine how much work to get to the end stage of that, but really well done there.
yeah, thank you.
And of course, Stu, I want to respect your time here. So again, fantastic insights here. So before we wrap up, last couple questions for you. On the personal side of things, always interested in morning routines. I had your colleague, Dr. Martin Gabala, on last year, share his AM routine with us. So, how about yourself? Are you a coffee guy? Are you straight into the lab in the morning?
Sure.
How does that
Yeah.
day start for you?
I'm a hardcore coffee guy. I enjoy espresso in the morning. It usually starts out with a double espresso. I'm in the gym by either 5:30 or probably 6 in the morning. If my workout isn't done within an hour, I think I'm wasting my time.
Nice.
I put headphones on. I don't talk to anybody.
Get down to business, right?
Yeah, it's like church for me. It's sort of my sanctuary, and it's kind of where I get my karma square for the rest of the day. I never used to think about daily steps, but as I get a little bit older, I do wear the Fitbit or a version of it to remind me that I should be aiming to move a lot more than I do because I sit down on my butt for a lot of the day, I'll be honest. And yeah, I kind of, that's sort of 5 to 6 days a week. And usually one day a week, I let myself sleep in.
Hey, here you go, right? Sleep is key for recovery. So sounds like great advice.
Sleep is, I was asked to give a talk a couple of years ago about, future trends in basically sort of exercise science. And I said, everybody needs to learn some more about sleep because I think sleep to me that's the next year. I understand that, and you're involved in high level sport, is that there are a number of these sleep consultants that are now cropping up about telling people when they should sleep, what they should do. And I'm like, that sounds like a pretty good gig. So, and it can definitely affect performance. So a huge new area.
Yeah, it's amazing stuff. Had Dr. Amy Bender on, and of course Sheree Ma from Stanford. And it's it is amazing how the performance benefits, recovery benefits, and totally free too. So
yeah, well, and the other thing is I mean, outside of that is all of the adverse health consequences associated with poor or short duration sleep. And I'm not the world's greatest sleeper, so it put the fear of the Lord into me. I'll tell you, I have a resolution for 2018, and it is to improve the quality of my sleep. So.
Terrific. Well, listen, Stu, last one here for you. What's the biggest take-home advice you would give an athlete on the evidence-based use of supplements in sport?
So to me, supplements are the icing on the cake. They are, or the sprinkles on the icing on the cake. You got to get we talked about sleep. You got to get your training's got to be consistent. Your sleep's got to be consistent. Your nutrition has to be dialed in, and by that I mean consistency and getting all of the macros in proportion. And those are the fundamental foundations on which the pyramid that peaks with top performance really rests. And the supplements are these small things that you add on top. And for some people, they can make a difference. I mean, it could be the difference between. Most mere mortals, I got to be honest and say, I don't know that they make that much of a difference. The younger the athlete is, I really think that you need to dial in, 1, 2, and 3 first. For the people closer to the top, it could be the performance advantage that they need. But you got to get the fundamentals dialed in before anybody even looks at supplements. So most young athletes flip the thing on its head and they just sort of say, which supplements will get me to the top? And I'm like, none of those. You need to get the basics down first.
Fantastic. Well, listen, Stu, I really appreciate you taking the time out today. Appreciate all your phenomenal work. Definitely a huge influence at us at Canada Basketball. And again, thank you for even sharing so much on the social media, things like Twitter, in terms of spreading the message. So, where can people stay connected with your fantastic work and keep up with getting connected with you on social media?
Yeah, well, so first, it was a real pleasure, and I like doing these sort of things because I do like to try and reach a broader audience. I realize that publishing scientific papers is great, and that's my currency, clearly, but the practical message. So it's a huge pleasure, and thank you for the honor of having me on your show. I am on social media, MacKinProf, MacKinProf on Twitter and Instagram. I'm on Facebook. Find me, friend me. I'll try or if you can't, follow me. And I try and get messages out, usually science-based, laced a little bit sometimes with my opinion. So, which I try to keep in check, but it's runneth over.